This is Unit 5, Day 9. We started today with this warm-up, so pause the video to do the warm-up and then play to check your answers. So the first one, write the equation of a circle with a center of -3, 4 and a radius of 6. So that, that equation is x minus -3, so plus 3, the quantity squared, plus y minus 4, the quantity squared, equals r squared, which is 6 squared, which is 36. So that's your equation. Next, solve the equation for number 1, in number 1 for y. So I'm going to first subtract x plus 3, the quantity squared, from, oops. Let's just try that again. I'm trying to write that I'm subtracting x plus 3, the quantity squared, from both sides. So that's going to give me the quantity y minus 4 squared is equal to 36 minus the quantity x plus 3 squared. So then I'm going to take the square root of both sides, which is going to give me the absolute value of y minus 4 is equal to, remember, we can't break that up, so we're going to leave it alone. Next, I have y minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 36 minus the quantity x plus 3 squared. And then lastly, let's add 4 to both sides. So y equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 36 minus the quantity x plus 3 squared. That is my equation for the circle in y equals form. So next we're going to divide 128 by 7 and no calculator. So the first thing you're going to do is set that up. Remember that the number that you're dividing into goes inside the house. We call that the dividend. What you're dividing by goes outside. We call that what you're dividing by the divisor. And then our answer will be the quotient. So we're figuring out how many times 7 goes into 1. Well, it doesn't. So then how many times does 7 go into 12? It goes in 1 time. So then I do 7 times 1, which is 7, and I subtract. 12 minus 7 is 5. I bring down the 8, and then I start all over again. 7 into 58 goes in 8 times. 7 times 8 is 56. I subtract, I get 2. And then you learned originally to just write the big R for the remainder, 2. Eventually you learned to put the remainder, which is 2, as a fraction over the divisor, which is 7. So 18 and 2/7 is another way that you learn to write that, or you may have even written 18 plus 2/7. Either is fine. Okay, so that's what we did to start class today. All right, so then today we're going to be looking at long division with polynomials, with expressions involving variables. So we are going to set it up the same way. We're going to put our dividend, which is what we're dividing into, we're going to put that inside the house, I think you called it when you were younger. So we're going to put the x squared minus 8x plus 12. Then the divisor is our x minus 2. That's going to go on the outside. And then we're going to figure out how many times x minus 2 goes into x squared minus 8x plus 12. And our quotient will go up top here. So what we're doing first is we're deciding how many times x, so I'm just looking at the x, I'm not looking at the whole expression x minus 2. How many times x goes into x squared? And that is x times. And when I figure out how many times, in this case x, I'm going to put that right over top of the same type of term. So in other words, I'm not going to put the x here because that's over the x squared. I'm going to put it over the x term. So I'm going to put the x there. So then what I do next, just like I did a moment ago with the numbers, is I'm going to multiply. So x times x is x squared. But it's not just x, it is a binomial, it's x minus 2, so I have to distribute the x to the -2 as well, which gives me -2x. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do, we know we would normally subtract. Well, I'm subtracting an expression, a binomial. So what I've found over the years that makes things a little bit easier is if you change the signs on these and then add, because we know adding the opposite is the same thing as subtracting. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to change the signs and then we're going to add. The x squareds are gone. Negative 8x plus 2x gives me negative 6x. And then just like we did with the numbers, the next term comes down. So plus 12. Just like we did with the numbers, then we start the division process all over again. Again, just looking at the x for a moment, how many times does it go into negative 6x? It goes in negative 6 times. I'm putting the number over the number. And then negative 6 is being multiplied by x, which is negative 6x. And negative 6 times negative 2 gives me positive 12. Remember, we're subtracting, so we're going to change the signs and then add, and our remainder is 0. So the quotient is x minus 6. Okay, so that's our long division, polynomial long division process. Now, I explained in class that today I really just want you to learn how to use polynomial long division. But then over the next several days, we're going to talk about what that means, the meaning. So we did talk a little bit about that today. So if you're getting a 0 remainder, and I posed this question to the class, if you're getting a 0 remainder, what does that mean? And some things that came up were, if you're getting a 0 remainder, that means that both x minus 6 and x minus 2 are factors. Okay, so we can include that. They're factors of the original dividend. Okay. Now, again, we can only say that because we got a 0 remainder. If we didn't get a 0 remainder, that would not be true. But because we did get a 0 remainder, that's true. Also, if x minus 2 and x minus 6 are factors, then we know that x equals 2 and x equals 6 are roots. Okay, and again, that's because we got that 0 remainder. And then I think someone else maybe said that that means that x minus 6 times x minus 2 is x squared minus 8x plus 12. And again, that's correct. And that's kind of the same thing as saying that they're factors. So those are all things that we know because we got that 0 remainder. Again, we'll talk a lot more about that in the next several lessons. Okay, so then let's try this one. Now, what I explained again was we are going to set this up the same way we did the last one, but notice how the dividend is missing some terms. It goes from cubed to the number. It's missing the squared term and the x term. So when that happens, when you're missing terms like that, you are going to want to fill in zeros for those missing terms. Okay, so here's what I mean by that. I'm setting up my dividend, and I'm gonna write x cubed, but then I'm gonna write plus 0x squared plus 0x and then minus 8. Okay, and you're always going to want to fill those missing terms in if there are missing terms. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to divide that by the divisor, which is x squared plus 2x plus 4. Okay, so here we go. I'm getting ready to do the division process. So I'm looking at just the first term, x squared, and just x cubed, and I'm deciding how many times that x squared goes into x cubed, and I know it goes in x times. So I'm ready to put that over the x. Okay, now the reason I always have you put the same type of term over top of that type of term is if I forgot to fill in the zeros here, I would catch myself at this point because I know that I need x times x squared to get x cubed. Well, if I didn't fill these zeros in, I'd go to put the x over top of the x and there would be no x. So that would be a reminder that, oops, I forgot to fill in those zeros. So that's why we do that. So x then is being multiplied by all three of these terms. So x times x squared is x cubed, x times 2x is 2x squared, and x times 4 is 4x. Remember, we're subtracting, so we're going to change all of these signs. So they're going to become negative. So then I have 0x squared minus 2x squared, which is negative 2x squared, and 0x minus 4x is negative 4x. Now I'm ready to bring that next term down, which is negative 8. And then I'm starting all over again. X squared into negative 2x squared goes in negative 2 times. So negative 2 times x squared is negative 2x squared. Negative 2 times 2x is negative 4x. And negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. I'm subtracting these, so I'm going to change the signs, and I'm going to add. And when I do that, I'm getting a remainder of 0, which means then that our quotient is x minus 2. Okay, and again, I'm mostly just today concerned with can you do that long division process. But once again, because we got that 0 remainder, we know that 2 is a root. We know that x squared plus 2x plus 4 is a factor. And we know that x minus 2 is a factor of x cubed minus 8. Now, if you think about that, you actually already did know that x minus 2 and x squared plus 2x plus 4 were factors, because look at this. This is difference of cubes. We know how to factor difference of cubes. Okay, so next, this one. So once again, I see that in the dividend, we're missing an x squared term, so we're going to remember to fill in a 0 there. So we have x cubed plus 0x squared minus 5x minus 6, and the divisor, we're dividing that by x minus 1. So here we go, x into x cubed goes in x squared times. So I put it over the x squared times x is x cubed. X squared times negative 1 is negative 1x squared. I'm subtracting, so I'm going to change these signs and add 1x squared plus 0x squared is 1x squared. Next, I'm going to bring down the negative 5x, and I'm going to start all over again. So x into x squared goes in x times. X times x squared, or x times x is x squared, and x times negative 1 is negative 1x. So I'm subtracting, meaning changing the signs, and negative 5x plus 1x is negative 4x. Then I'm bringing the negative 6 down. So then x into negative 4x goes in negative 4 times. So negative 4 times x is negative 4x, and negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4. I'm changing the signs because I'm subtracting, so adding the opposite, and negative 6 plus negative 4 is negative 10. So this one does not have a 0 remainder. So the way that we're going to deal with that is similar to what you did when you first learned, well, you first learned with the big R. I'm not going to write big R negative 10, but what I am going to do is I'm going to write plus, and then I'm going to take the remainder, which is negative 10, and I'm going to write that as a fraction over top of the divisor, which is x minus 1. And that is my quotient. Okay, now when you don't get a 0 remainder, we don't know as much about the polynomial as we do if we get a 0 remainder. So what we know here is that x minus 1 is not a factor and 1 is not a root, because if they were, then we'd be getting a 0 remainder. So we don't know really as much. We just know that x minus 1 is not a factor and 1's not a root. But there's our quotient to the division problem. Okay, so let's try this one. So we're going to again set up the dividend. We're going to remember that 0x squared term. And we're dividing by x plus 1. And I think in class I had students try this one and then we went over it. So you might want to pause the video and then play to check your answers. So x goes into x cubed x squared times x is x cubed. X squared times 1 is 1x squared. Subtracting, so changing the signs and adding. 0 minus 1 is negative 1x squared. Bringing down the next term. X into negative x squared goes in negative x times. Negative x times x is negative x squared. Negative x times 1 is negative x. So I'm changing signs because I'm adding. Negative 7 plus 1 is negative 6x. bringing down the next term, which is negative 6. All over again, x into negative 6x goes in negative 6 times. Negative 6 times x is negative 6x. And negative 6 times 1 is negative 6. Subtracting, so changing the signs and adding, we are getting a 0 remainder this time. So our quotient is x squared minus x minus 6. So go ahead and check that, see if that's what you got. Okay, that takes care of today's lesson. So you're going to do those problems for tomorrow. Midterms coming up, you need to start working on your review packet, and quiz will be, you can see the date for that,